Okay, folks, so we're picking up where we left off. Remember, we looked at this chart here, where we saw the progression of the different states in Book VIII of Plato's Republic. So now we're going to look at the question of what in itself is wrong with democracy. One concern is that democracy is an unstable form of government. But as we'll see, Plato also thinks that democracy in and of itself would not be a good form of government to have. So here's the first thing that we want to look at in Book VIII of the Republic, is a criticism that's actually made against an oligarchic government. So this is from page 115 in your textbook, or if you're working with another edition of Plato, 551c. Here's a passage from the Jowett translation. It says this: "Just think what would happen if pilots were to be chosen according to their property, and a poor man were refused permission to steer, even though he were a better pilot." Glaucon responds, "You mean that they would shipwreck?" "Yes, and is this not true of the government of anything?" Glaucon replies, "Yes, I imagine so. Except a city, or would you include a city?" "Nay," he said, "the case of a city is the strongest of all, inasmuch as the rule of a city is the greatest and most difficult of all." So we've got an interesting argument here. We're saying it seems absurd that we would let somebody pilot a ship on the basis of their having the most money, especially if someone with less money were a better pilot. We would get a shipwreck here. Obviously a bad thing. Steering a ship is a kind of government, and running a city obviously is a kind of government. So why would we let the rich, rather than the most capable, rule the city? Well, this is presented as a problem for oligarchy, but it's a problem for democracy too. Why let the person who has the most skill in winning votes run a city instead of the person who has the most capability in actual governance, rationality, and the capability to rule? So I already showed you this comic in the first video, this comic by Will McPhail. It seems like running a question of literally piloting a plane is not the kind of thing that we want to leave to a vote, right? It's the kind of thing that we want to leave to experts. So to simply have a resentful passenger saying, "These smug pilots have lost touch with regular passengers like us, who thinks I should fly the plane?" Well, that seems absurd. So that's going to be sort of our first worry about democracy, as we see in Plato. Democracy lets the people most skilled in getting votes run a city instead of the people who are actually the most skilled in governance. And remember, an important argumentative move in Plato's Republic is the city-soul analogy, right? A just city is going to be literally analogous to a just soul. The word justice doesn't mean two different things. It's a property that can be had by cities and individuals alike. So what happens when you have a democratic man? Well, one claim that Plato makes is that the democratic man cannot distinguish between necessary and unnecessary appetites. So necessary appetites are the ones that you cannot get rid of. Uh, and they're also going to be essential for your well-being, right? But the democratic man is going to be governed by appetites in a drone-like way. So when Plato is talking about drones, he's basically talking about, bees living in a hive. The idea here is that a drone acts in a way that is unthinking, right? It just goes for things on the basis of impulse and instinct. And because the democratic man sees all appetites as equal, it's just going to go for whatever appetites are right in front of them. So these appetites basically seize the soul, as Socrates puts it. And in this kind of approach to living, moderation, this sort of wise, prudent pursuit of your desires, managing them within reason, is banished as illiberal. So within this context, that's just about satisfying appetites, vices are going to be treated as virtues. So for instance, anarchy is going to be treated as freedom. And here's a great point. It's that in a democratic city, it's if the guiding pleasures are chosen by lot, by basically pulling them out of a hat, as it were. Remember, the idea is that each mental state or mental event or impulse within a person, when we run the city soul analogy, can be each mental state is analogous to a person, right? And in democracies, governance was chosen by lot, right? So just like pulling a pleasure out of the hat and being ruled by that particular impulse, well, that's a poor way to manage your soul, right? Because then, for instance, your desire to eat some Cheetos could be pulled out by chance and become your ruling passion. Well, why would we allow any old person to be chosen out of a city to run our democratic government? So the idea that there's disorder within democracy is the idea that every appetite is seen as equal. There's no difference between an appetite worth pursuing versus an appetite not worth pursuing. It's just like how democracy is supposed to say that everybody's vote, no matter how well-informed or poorly informed, counts the same. So within this democratic city, the biggest value is going to be freedom. And the way that Plato puts it is this democratic city is going to have every kind of regime, club, and association. And when we have an emphasis on freedom, there's no obligation to do any particular job, even if you're best suited for them. So within this democratic city, and there's freedom, even if you have the perfect body and perfect temperament to be a soldier, you have no obligation whatsoever to fight as a soldier within this democratic city. Or if you have the perfect temperament and mind for governing within the democratic city, you can shirk that responsibility. Within this context where, again, freedom is a fundamental value, there's a lack of respect for authority. So fathers act like children and children act like fathers. Basically, you've got toddlers bossing around their parents. Schoolmasters, Socrates points out, will fear and flatter their pupils. So instead of placing a focus on educating their students, educators will be more focused on being liked by them. We might wonder if there's an analogy to present-day education with its focus on teachers being beholden to teaching reviews, right? Insofar as that happens, we might get things like grade inflation, where teachers are more concerned about getting a good review than actually educating students. So the idea is that if there's a lack of authoritativeness among parents or teachers, that there may be certain breakdowns in the ability to perform according to a certain role. Socrates also points out that within a democracy, slaves are just as free as purchasers, and there's going to be equal relations between men and women. Of course, Plato and Socrates see these things as bad things. To our modern eyes, these are more than welcome. But as we can see, this may be simply reflective of a very different outlook. He even points out that animals are given too much freedom. So within a democratic city, there will be no rules about how oxen are to move about the streets, and you're more likely to be run over, probably. So within this democratic city, we're going to have a lot of volatility and disorder. And because of this, basically the meaning of volatility and disorder, what that comes to is that the changes in the city are going to be unpredictable, and there may be wild swings from one regime to the next. Again, to take this right into modern times, we might think of the swing between the Obama administration and the Trump administration as one example of how a democratic form of government is going to have a lot of volatility and swings from one thing to the other. So to do anything in excess seldom fails to provoke a violent reaction to the opposite extreme, not only in the seasons of the year and in the animal and vegetable kingdoms, but also in regimes. Excessive freedom is unlikely to pass into anything but excessive slavery in the case of cities as well as individuals. So democracy starts with this rationale of promoting freedom as much as possible, but it eventually descends into a tyrannical state. So this leads us back to this question of whether a stable democracy is actually a possible thing. So within this context, Plato is going to say no. The democratic city is bound with this disorder and volatility to devolve into tyranny. So that sort of wraps up our discussion of why Plato doesn't like democracy, at least the criticisms of democracy that appear in Book 8 of the Republic. Of course, there are other problems with democracy that come out in other parts of Plato. So just for instance, it's through democratic means that Socrates is eventually sentenced to death in the Apology. So just to look ahead quickly in the Republic, so we'll remember that Book 9 argues that a tyrannical soul is a disordered soul and is therefore going to be unhappy. So therefore, the just life is actually the happy life. It's the better life to choose. And the reason why you should not act unjustly. And then in Book 10, the final book, Plato argues that poets and poetry should be banned from Callipolis because they get us away from recognizing the form of the good. Being too into poetry is sort of like worshiping facsimiles or images or illusions rather than caring about what's really real, which, according to Plato, is the forms, including the form of the good. So those are just a couple of points to see where the broader argument of the Republic goes. So that's going to wrap it up for the Republic. So we're going to keep thinking about Plato's challenges to democracy next time, and we're going to look at a contemporary defense of Plato against democracy by the philosopher Richard Kraut. So that's where we'll pick up later in the week. Hopefully you had as much fun as I did reading Book 8 of the Republic. It's fun to dive into every time you do. So keep thinking it through and also start thinking about what you would say back to Socrates. Is it possible for a stable democracy to remain in existence over time? How do we deal with this issue of volatility and factions? So that'll be something for you to think about, and it'll be something maybe for you to write about in the discussion forums. So, thanks for listening in today, and we will pick things up with Richard Kraut's defense of Plato next time. All right, take care, everybody.